October 14, 1943, 6:17 in the morning. Polebrook Airfield, Northamptonshire, England. The ground is wet. A thin English rain has been falling since before midnight, and the tarmac gleams under the exhaust wash of 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines turning over in the grey pre-dawn dark. The sound is not pleasant. It is enormous, a low, continuous, chest-compressing roar that vibrates the fillings in a man's back teeth and drowns every other sound in the world. Birds have fled from the field perimeter. The foxes that forage near the fence line have vanished into the hedgerows. The trees beyond the airfield boundary stand perfectly still in the wet dark, indifferent to everything. Inside the briefing room, 90 minutes ago, a curtain was drawn aside and a red ribbon stretched across a map of Central Europe. The ribbon ran from this very airfield, from this patch of wet Northamptonshire tarmac, east across the English Channel, across the occupied continent, deep into the industrial heart of Bavaria, to a city called Schweinfurt. The ball-bearing factories there. Again, the men in that briefing room looked at the map, and then some of them looked at the floor, and the room was very quiet for a moment before the intelligence officer began to speak. They had been to Schweinfurt before. They knew what the ribbon meant. A 22-year-old waist gunner from Bowling Green, Kentucky is pulling on his heated flight suit in the pre-dawn dark of the barracks. His name is not in any book of heroism. He is one of 10 men in one of 291 aircraft preparing to take off from bases scattered across East Anglia and Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire on this October morning. He is wearing 5 layers of clothing and a parachute harness and an oxygen mask that smells of rubber and cold metal. In his left breast pocket, beneath the flight suit, beneath the wool jacket, beneath the cotton undershirt, there is a photograph. His mother took it in the backyard of a wood frame house in Bowling Green, Kentucky, on the Sunday before he shipped out. In the photograph, a kitchen table is visible through the screen door behind him. On the table is a coffee pot, brown ceramic, the kind that his mother filled every single morning of his boyhood without any particular ceremony, because it was always there, because it was ordinary, because abundance, in America, does not announce itself. It simply exists, quietly, on the kitchen table, waiting to be poured. He does not think about the photograph as he climbs into the aircraft. He does not think about the coffee pot. He is thinking about the ribbon on the map, and about the 34 men who did not come back the last time this squadron flew east toward Bavaria. He closes the hatch. The engines increase their pitch. The aircraft begins to roll. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses will depart English soil this morning. 60 of them will not return. That is one aircraft destroyed every 3 minutes of the mission's duration. The 8th Air Force will call this the second Schweinfurt raid. History will remember it as Black Thursday, the single worst day the American bomber force will ever endure over Europe. But this story does not end at Schweinfurt. This story does not end in a flak burst over Bavaria or in the cold water of the North Sea or in a German prisoner of war compound behind a fence of wire. This story begins in all of those places, and it ends somewhere far quieter, and far stranger, and in many ways far more difficult to fully understand. This story ends at the kitchen table. This story ends with the coffee pot. To understand what truly happened to the men of America's wartime bomber force after the guns fell silent, it is necessary to first understand the full weight of what they had survived, because what a man carries home from war is shaped entirely by the nature of what that war required of him. And what the strategic bombing campaign over Europe required of its crews was something that stood apart, even within the extraordinary catalogue of human sacrifice that defines the Second World War. The 8th Air Force, based in England, tasked with the systematic destruction of Nazi Germany's industrial and military capacity from the air, was, by any honest and fully documented measure, the most statistically dangerous assignment available to any American service member in uniform during the entire course of the war. More than 350,000 Americans served in its ranks over the course of the conflict. Of those, over 26,000 were killed in action. Before that number moves past the eye too quickly, it deserves to be placed in context. The entire United States Marine Corps, across every island and every volcanic beach from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, across every brutal yard of the Pacific Island hopping campaign, sustained fewer fatal casualties in the same war. The 8th Air Force, a single air command, based on a cold and rain-soaked island in the North Atlantic, flying bombers over an occupied continent, lost more men than every Marine who died in the Pacific theater. The magnitude of that comparison does not diminish the sacrifice of the Marines. It simply establishes the scale of what the bomber crews endured. An additional 28,000 of the 8th Airmen were shot down and captured, funneled into the prisoner of war camps of the Third Reich. The stalags and offlogs scattered across occupied Europe, the cold compounds behind barbed wire and watchtowers where men spent months and sometimes years surviving on thin soup and hoarded information, and the stubborn, daily act of refusing to believe that the war would not, eventually, turn in the right direction. When the full arithmetic of the bomber war was assembled and examined, 2/3 of all men assigned to the 8th Air Force could expect, on a statistical basis, to die, be seriously wounded, suffer a disabling psychological breakdown, or be taken prisoner before the war's end. 2 out of every 3 men who reported for duty on the East Anglian bases could apply that fraction to themselves, personally, and find it mathematically accurate. These numbers were never published in the mess halls. They were never posted on the squadron bulletin boards alongside the mission orders and the weather reports. But the men calculated them for themselves, informally, from the evidence that surrounded them every day, the empty chairs at the morning briefing, the uncollected mail accumulating in the squadron post room, the beds that were stripped and remade for new arrivals within 24 hours of a crew's last mission. The numbers were in the air along with the engine exhaust and the English fog. By the winter of 1943, the average life expectancy of a single B-17 Flying Fortress over Germany had been calculated, and the calculation was 11 missions. A tour of duty required 25. In the 100th Bomb Group, a unit stationed at Thorpe Abbotts in Norfolk that would earn the grim and involuntary distinction of being called the Bloody 100th, only 14% of the crews assigned in May of 1943 would survive to fly their 25th and final mission. Only 14%. The men knew this. They knew, in the way that proximity to statistics eventually makes knowledge visceral rather than intellectual, that the mathematics were not in their favor. They climbed into the aircraft anyway. They strapped themselves into their assigned positions. Pilot and co-pilot in the nose, navigator and bombardier behind them, radio operator amidships, top turret gunner above, ball turret gunner beneath the fuselage in his cramped and exposed position, 2 waist gunners at their open windows, tail gunner at the rear, and they flew east in tight formations across the gray expanse of the North Sea toward a continent that was waiting for them with everything it had. They flew into this, not once, not twice, but mission after mission, at intervals of sometimes only 48 hours, until either the tour was completed or the mathematics made its assertion, and they did not come back. Some came back. This is the story of what happened to them next. Before the war ended, before the surrender documents were signed and the red ribbon was taken down from the briefing room maps for the last time, the men of the 8th Air Force had begun to develop their own vocabulary for what was happening inside them. This was a necessity, because the official language was inadequate, and because what they were experiencing was something that the military establishment of 1943 had neither the clinical framework nor the institutional willingness to fully acknowledge as real. They called it flak happy. They called it the Focke-Wulf jitters. The older men who remembered the previous war used the older phrase, shell shock. The Army's official designation was combat fatigue, a term calibrated to suggest that what a man needed was rest, the way an overworked muscle needs rest, and that rest would restore him to his previous functional condition. What they were actually describing, and what the medical community would not fully codify under its proper diagnostic name for another 4 decades, was post-traumatic stress disorder. The symptoms were consistent across rank and position. A man would begin to lose weight, and then more weight, until his face acquired the hollowed and over-attentive expression of someone whose nervous system had reset itself for continuous threat and could not locate the switch to return it to something quieter. He would stop sleeping through the night, waking in the small hours from dreams that were vivid with a precision that ordinary dreams do not possess. Not the loose symbolic machinery of common nightmares, but the exact, high-resolution replay of specific moments, specific altitudes, specific sounds. He would react to sudden noises, a door slamming in the barracks corridor, a lorry engine firing on the lane behind the airfield, with a physical response entirely disproportionate to the stimulus, a sudden rigid stillness, a rapid reorientation of the eyes toward the source of the sound, something the men around him recognized immediately as something beyond ordinary surprise. He would grow quiet and withdrawn. He would sit alone outside the Nissen hut in the cold English evening, on an upturned crate or a wooden step, saying nothing when a crewmate came looking for him. The men had terms for this, spoken in the dark with the particular mixture of affection and dread that combat units reserve for the subject of psychological collapse. They said he was going around the bend. They said he needed a rest. What they did not say, because the social fabric of the bomber crew depended on a certain shared and enforced confidence, a collective commitment to the working fiction of survivability, was what they actually believed, that they were watching a man reach a limit that existed somewhere inside all of them, and that the only meaningful difference between him and themselves was the number of missions remaining on the tour sheet. When the condition became severe enough to ground a man from flying status, the 8th Air Force had established, in partnership with the American Red Cross, a network of recovery facilities in commandeered English country estates. These were the places the airmen called, with their characteristic sardonic affection, flak houses. They were set in Elizabethan manners with long gravel drives and Georgian country homes with formal gardens along quiet village lanes, their peacetime order preserved with a deliberateness that must have seemed almost hallucinatory to men arriving from the flight lines of East Anglia. The men at the flak houses were given civilian clothes to wear for the duration of their stay, a calculated act of psychological restoration, as if removing the uniform might allow the nervous system to accept, provisionally, that it was no longer at war. They fished in the estate ponds. They played tennis on courts that had not been maintained since before the bombing started. They walked the grounds in the cold and quiet afternoons, breathing clean country air, eating hot regular meals, sleeping, or trying to sleep, in rooms with curtains and carpet and no engine vibration in the walls and no mission scheduled for the morning. Some recovered. Some returned to their units and completed their tours and never spoke about the flak house stay to anyone. Others did not recover, and they were transferred away from flying duties permanently, their records marked with 2 letters, RFS, removed from flying status. That some of them would carry for the rest of their lives as a private verdict against which they had no right of appeal and which no accumulation of post-war success would entirely erase. The broader numbers tell a story that no individual case can fully contain. Across all American service branches during World War II, more than 500,000 service members suffered some form of psychiatric collapse severe enough to require medical intervention. 40% of all medical discharges issued during the war years were attributed to psychiatric conditions. A military psychiatrist named John Appel, who spent months studying combat exhaustion casualties among infantry soldiers at Monte Cassino and Anzio, arrived at a conclusion so stark that it was distributed through official channels with considerable reluctance. Practically all men in combat battalions who are not otherwise disabled ultimately become psychiatric casualties. The 8th Air Force had no rational basis for believing itself exempt from this arithmetic. What it had, instead, was altitude. And altitude, it turned out, offered no exemption. On September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, aboard the deck of the USS Missouri, the instruments of Japan's formal surrender were signed in the presence of General Douglas MacArthur and the representatives of the Allied powers. As the signatures were completed, 500 American aircraft passed overhead in formation, the last formation any of them would ever fly over a hostile horizon. The war was over. For the men still posted at their English bases, for the bomber crews still stationed across Italy and the Pacific, the news arrived through the channels of institutional bureaucracy, radio broadcasts, official orders, the gradual and disbelieving unwinding of the daily schedule that had structured every waking hour for years. The mission stopped. The briefing stopped. The curtain was drawn across the map in the briefing room for the last time, and the red ribbon that had stretched east toward Schweinfurt and Stuttgart and Berlin and the oil refineries of Ploesti was rolled up and put away. And the ribbon, unlike the men who had followed it, would never be called upon again. The mechanism assembled to return them home was, in its scale and speed and organizational ambition, without precedent in the recorded history of human logistics. Operation Magic Carpet began on September 6, 1945. It would run for 360 consecutive days. At its operational peak, it transported 22,222 Americans home every single day. More than 8 million men and women, scattered across 55 theaters of war on 4 continents, were gathered and sorted and processed through a point system that calculated their months overseas and their wounds and their combat decorations, and loaded onto anything that could cross an ocean. Converted aircraft carriers with their hangar decks fitted with bunks and their flight decks crowded with men watching the horizon. Liberty ships that had spent the war carrying crated munitions now carried the men those munitions had been built to protect. The great British ocean liner Queen Mary, stripped of her peacetime luxury and pressed into service as a mass transport since 1940, made run after run across the North Atlantic, her first-class dining room converted to an enlisted mess where men who had survived Black Thursday over Schweinfurt and the burning skies above the Ruhr ate eggs from aluminum trays and drank coffee from steel cups and watched England fall away behind them through the salt-stained portholes, and felt something they could not name. The harbor at New York City became the stage for an emotion that English does not possess a single word sufficient to hold. Crowds lined the Battery and the piers at every hour of the day. Women held children above their shoulders to see above the crowd. Tugboats sounded their horns in long, low notes that carried across the water and could be heard on the decks of the incoming transports a long way out. The men crowded at the rails of the ships watched the skyline of Manhattan the way men watch things they had privately decided they would never see again. Some of them stood perfectly still, as though the act of moving might cause what they were seeing to dissolve. Some wept. Some laughed at themselves for weeping. Most said nothing, because the distance between what they were returning from and what they were returning to was not something that language, in that particular and charged moment, was equipped to bridge. They passed through separation centers. Final medical examinations, conducted with the efficient impersonality of institutions processing enormous volumes of humanity. A form to sign. A small manila envelope. A check for back pay. A sergeant behind a counter who handed over a discharge certificate with the practice speed of a man who had done this 200 times today and would do it 200 more times tomorrow. The papers were in hand. The uniform could now, technically, be folded. A man was no longer sergeant, no longer captain. No longer a member of the 100th Bomb Group or the 384th or the 91st Bomb Group or any of the other units whose designations had defined his identity for years. He was a veteran. He was a civilian. He was, for the first time since he had raised his right hand and been sworn in, entirely alone with the question of what came next. What these men expected, returning to the country they had left, was what youth and sacrifice tend together to produce as an expectation, immediate and uncomplicated restoration. The house, intact. The family, unchanged by the years of separation. The ease and warmth of America, which they had crossed the Atlantic to defend, and which had been present throughout the war as a kind of continuous background radiation in every letter from home, in every package of cookies that arrived at the East Anglian bases still faintly carrying the smell of the kitchen in which they had been made, available at last, fully and without qualification, as the simple reward of having survived. What many of them found was more complicated, and in certain ways more disorienting, than anything they had been trained or prepared to navigate. The country had changed in ways that the war's velocity had obscured from a distance. 6 million women had entered the paid workforce for the first time during the war years, building identities and degrees of economic independence that the prevailing social expectation of 1945, that they would simply and willingly return to domesticity at the war's end, could not always overcome. Marriages that had survived years of separation on the tensile strength of letters now had to survive proximity, and proximity revealed incompatibilities that correspondence had smoothed over with selective emphasis. Divorce rates climbed steeply in the immediate post-war years. Housing shortages were severe in the cities and in the defense industry suburbs where so much of the wartime population had concentrated. A man who had flown B-17s out of Norfolk could find himself, in the autumn of 1945, sleeping on a fold-out cot in his parents' living room in Dayton or Nashville or Sacramento, lying awake in the early hours of the morning listening to the ordinary sounds of a sleeping American household, the tick of a radiator, the settling of floor joists, the distant passage of a car on the street outside. While inside his own nervous system the machinery that had kept him alive at altitude over Germany continued to run quietly and without stopping, like an engine that no one had told it was now safe to shut down. The nightmares arrived with the reliable punctuality of old debts. They were not the loose and symbolic machinery of ordinary dreaming. They were vivid with a specificity that only true memory possesses. The flak burst opening at 27,000 feet directly level with the left wing, the interphone going silent in the middle of a sentence during a fighter pass over Leipzig, the particular quality of light through the plexiglass waist gun window on a cloudless morning just before the sky ahead of the formation filled with black bursts. These men had been shaped, by the culture of the bomber crew and by the broader social ethic of their generation, to carry such things without display. The word that families most commonly used, decades later, when asked to describe their fathers or their grandfathers who had flown for the 8th Air Force, was a single, simple word, quiet. He was quiet about it. He never talked about the war. He put it behind him and moved on. This was not entirely accurate. It was more precise to say that he carried it forward rather than leaving it behind, but he carried it quietly, and mostly in private, and without the language or the institutional infrastructure to name what he was carrying or ask anyone for help with its weight. The government had prepared for the economic dimensions of the return with more foresight than most generations of American veterans had previously been accorded. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, universally known as the GIBill, had been signed into law by Franklin Roosevelt in June of that year, before the war in either Europe or the Pacific had concluded, an act of institutional foresight that amounted to the government placing a bet, in advance, on men who were still flying missions that the mathematics said they were unlikely to survive. The bill offered returning veterans subsidized access to college education and vocational training, low-interest government-guaranteed home loans, and up to 1 year of unemployment compensation, $20 per week for 52 weeks, available with no conditions to any honorably discharged veteran who needed time and space to find his footing in a world that had kept turning during his absence. The men called it the 52-20 Club, and many of them used those weeks to stand in their parents' backyards in the September sun and relearn the rhythm of sleeping past 5 in the morning and sit in diners and drink coffee and feel the specific weight of having nowhere in particular to be. And the coffee. Let us speak, for a moment, about the coffee. It is a small thing. It seems a minor detail to reach for in the middle of a history of this magnitude, and perhaps it is. But the men who flew for the 8th Air Force in England had spent years subsisting on what wartime rationing and institutional catering could provide, thin, inconsistent, functional. Not the coffee of home. Not the coffee that the 22-year-old from Bowling Green had drunk every morning of his boyhood at his mother's kitchen table, from the brown ceramic pot that sat on the same surface every day of his childhood without ceremony or comment, dark and hot and freely available, poured into a wide cup with no particular urgency because there was nowhere to be and nothing was rationed, and abundance, in that house, in that country, was simply the condition of ordinary morning life. When these men came home and sat down at a diner counter in Ohio or Georgia or California, and a waitress in a white apron set a cup of coffee in front of them and refilled it without being asked, and there was sugar in a glass dispenser and cream in a small metal pitcher, and the cup was warm between both hands, and outside the window the street was an ordinary American street with no flak towers and no contrails overhead and no searchlights moving across the sky at night. Something in those men registered what the coffee represented. Not luxury, not excess, not the spoils of victory, something quieter and more fundamental. The particular abundance of a free country, intact, undamaged, its diners still open, its mornings still unguarded, its streets still unhurried, its citizens still going about the business of their days in the full and unconscious confidence that no one was coming for them in the night. Some men wept, the first time they sat down to that cup of coffee. Some laughed, immediately afterward, at themselves for weeping over something so small. Most said nothing about it at all, and carried the knowledge of it with them for the rest of their lives, wordless and private, the way certain kinds of understanding can only be carried. The GIBill instruments worked, for those who were eligible to use them, with a thoroughness and a transformative power that exceeded most of what the government had initially projected. By 1947, 49% of all students enrolled in American colleges and universities were veterans. The campuses were overwhelmed and remade by the influx. Converted Quonset huts served as classrooms at dozens of institutions. Married veterans built improvised communities in the fields adjacent to university grounds, communities of trailers and prefabricated housing that had no architectural precedent and a ferocious, particular sense of forward motion. The men who sat in those classrooms had navigated by dead reckoning over cloud cover. They had performed emergency fuel consumption calculations under fire. They had led crews of 10 through conditions that no management textbook had ever described or anticipated. They came to the engineering lecture and the economics seminar and the law school moot court with a quality of purpose that their professors sometimes described, privately, as something between admiration and unease. These were not young men exploring their options. They had already met the only real alternative and found it, on balance, less acceptable than whatever came next. Nearly 8 million World War II veterans used education or training benefits under the original GI Bill before it expired in July of 1956. Millions more used the home loan guarantee to purchase houses in the new subdivisions that rose across the American landscape in those years with a speed that matched the urgency of the men moving into them. Streets that did not exist in 1943 were lined with young trees and children's bicycles by 1950. The sound of lawn mowers on Saturday mornings became the specific acoustic signature of a generation that had earned the right to the ordinary. A man who had flown bombing missions from East Anglia could own a house in a suburb of Cleveland or Richmond or Phoenix on a street with a mailbox and a neat lawn and a neighbor who waved from across the hedge, and the ordinariness of that existence, which might once, in another life, have seemed insufficient, now carried the specific weight of something that had genuinely and very nearly been lost. He knew, with a precision that no one who had stayed home could fully share, what the alternative to this looked like from 25,000 feet. He had seen the other version. He had flown over it. By the mid-1950s, 60% of the American population had achieved what contemporary analysts defined as a middle-class standard of living. This was not simply the product of economic momentum or historical accident. It was, in significant part, the direct result of a national decision to invest in the men who had served, to treat the GI Bill not as charity but as recognition, not as compensation for loss but as down payment on the future that their service had made possible. The bomber crews and the infantrymen and the sailors and the nurses built, from those investments and from their own particular endowments of skill and urgency and purpose, the American world of the second half of the 20th century, the campuses and the highways and the suburbs and the companies and the careers and the children sent to universities who would, in their own time, build the next version of the same country forward. But prosperity arrived ahead of healing. This is the distinction that the celebratory narrative of the post-war boom did not always make. Prosperity and healing are not the same thing, and in the culture of the late 1940s and 1950s, with its emphatic preference for forward motion and its social prohibition on dwelling, the gap between them was not widely acknowledged or examined. The men who drove to work in the new cars and mowed the new lawns and grilled in the new backyards on the long summer evenings of the Eisenhower years carried within them, in varying and often invisible degrees, the residue of what they had flown through. The culture offered no adequate container for it. Silence was understood as strength. The man who had completed 30 missions over the Reich and returned home to build a career and raise a family and coach Little League on Saturday mornings was, by the prevailing standards of his era, proof that America worked, that sacrifice led to prosperity, that the system was sound. The proof was expected to be clean and uncomplicated. The man himself knew that it contained material that was neither. The adrenaline that had been the atmosphere of the bombing campaign did not simply evaporate when the missions ended. The nervous system, once calibrated for the speeds and pressures and life-or-death demands of combat flying, does not recalibrate itself for suburban pace without friction. Veterans who formed motorcycle clubs in the late 1940s, who populated the early ranks of American road racing, who drove too fast on the new interstate highways in the new American automobiles of the 1950s. These were not men seeking destruction. They were men whose nervous systems had been permanently adjusted to a register that the civilian world, in its ordinary rhythms, could not sustain. They were looking, in the only socially available contexts, for the particular quality of aliveness that had characterized the most extreme years of their existence, and that peace had not yet found a way to replicate in less dangerous form. The reckoning, for many of these men, came not in 1945 and not in the busy, purposeful decades of the post-war boom, but much later. In the 1990s, 50 years after the end of the war, when Veterans Administration treatment centers across the country began to see an unexpected and significant influx of elderly World War II veterans seeking psychological help for the first time. These were men in their 70s and 80s. Men whose children were grown and whose careers were finished and whose days had acquired, in the quietude of late retirement, an unstructured spaciousness that was unfamiliar and, in ways they struggled to articulate, unsettling. The structures that had held the memories in organized check for decades, work, family, community, purpose, the constant forward pressure of building a life, had been removed one by the natural attrition of aging, and in their absence the memories moved into the space that was left. The clinical researchers who studied these cases noted something that was both medically informative and deeply human. Many of these men had not presented the full symptomatic profile of post-traumatic stress disorder in the immediate post-war years. The structure of their lives had provided a kind of scaffolding, not resolution, but management. The memories had been present throughout. They had simply been kept in a room that was never quite quiet enough for them to make themselves fully heard. It was only in the genuine silence of old age, in the long evenings after the children had gone and the career was finished and the lawn was permanently still, that the October morning over Schweinfurt came back with its original force and its original vividness and would not, this time, be asked to wait. The men who arrived at the VA centers in those years came carrying something they had never, in most cases, given a full accounting of to any other living person. Not to their wives, though some of those wives had spent 40 years watching for the signs. Not to their children, though some of those children had grown up in houses where certain questions were never asked and certain silences were never disturbed. Not to the doctors who had processed them through the separation centers in the autumn of 1945 and handed them their discharge papers and wished them well and moved on to the next man in the line. These veterans arrived at the VA centers carrying 50 years of managed silence and the particular exhaustion of having been, for half a century, the strongest person in every room they occupied. They had arrived home from the most dangerous assignment available to any American in uniform, and they had built careers and families and participated in the construction of the most prosperous peacetime society in American history, and they had done all of it without ever fully setting down the weight they had brought back from the sky above Germany. There is an accounting that history owes to these men, and it is an accounting that the celebratory version of the post-war American story does not always perform with adequate care. It is an accounting that begins not with the GI Bill and the suburbs and the universities and the prosperity of the 1950s, though all of those things are real and deserve their recognition, but with the briefing room at Pullbrook on the morning of October 14, 1943, and the red ribbon on the map, and the 90 men in that room who looked at the ribbon and then looked at the floor and then looked up again and did not leave. It is an accounting that includes the 14% of the bloody 100th who flew their 25th mission and came home. It includes the 86% who did not, and whose absence from every post-war reunion and every family photograph and every Veterans Day ceremony is itself a form of testimony about the cost of what the survivors had witnessed. It includes the 2 letters, RFS, that some men carried in private for 5 decades. It includes the silence at the dinner table when a grandchild, too young to know better, asked what it was like over there, and the veteran looked at the child for a moment and then said it was a long time ago and reached for the coffee cup, and the child accepted this, not understanding that the reaching for the cup was itself the answer, or at least the closest the man had ever come to giving one, because it always came back to the coffee. The brown ceramic pot on the kitchen table in Bowling Green, the diner counter in Dayton, the wide warm cup between both hands on an October morning in 1945, back on American soil, with no mission scheduled and no ribbon on any map waiting to be followed east. The coffee was ordinary. The coffee was always there, always hot, always refillable, asking nothing and costing almost nothing and representing, in its complete and unremarkable availability, the full and specific meaning of what these men had crossed the ocean to preserve. They had not flown those missions in the abstract. They had not sacrificed in service of a concept or a slogan or an ideological formulation written by men who would never themselves sit in the ball turret of AB-17 at 25,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley. They had flown for the ordinary. They had flown for the kitchen table and the screen door and the neighbor who waved from across the hedge on a Saturday morning and the child who ran down the street in the summer evening and would go to bed that night without knowing WHWN for the diner that was open, and the coffee that was always there. And the morning that belonged had flown one's military work on the new highways and ate dinner as families at kitchen tables that bond and required nothing of anyone except the ordinary business of being alive in a free country on a free day. This is what the men of America's wartime bomber force carried home from the sky above Germany. Not glory, though some of them received it. Not ease, though they built it, carefully, over the years that followed. Not the absence of the weight they had accumulated between 1942 and 1945, though they managed that weight, privately and imperfectly, for the rest of their lives. What they carried home was the knowledge, earned at a cost that cannot be exaggerated and should not be minimized, of what a free country is worth when it is genuinely at risk of being lost. They had seen the alternative from altitude. They had flown through the smoke of it, through the flak of it, through the frozen and contested sky above it, and they had come back to a country whose landscape bore none of the marks of what they had seen, and they had sat down at the kitchen table, and they had been grateful for the ordinary. They built the post-war world from that gratitude, and from the GI Bill, and from the urgency that only people who have looked directly at the possibility of losing something can possess when the thing is given back to them. They built the colleges and the suburbs and the careers and the companies. They raised children who would never know what it was to calculate their own survival in terms of missions remaining. They coached Little League and attended PTA meetings and drove toward no resemblance to the briefing room tables of East Anglia except in one small and significant detail: the coffee pot was always there. And in the small hours of certain nights, in the later decades, when the dreams came back with their original precision and the machinery of the nervous system ran briefly and uninvited through its old program. In those hours, the man lying awake in the suburban darkness of a free American night had only to listen for the silence. The silence of a country that was not burning. The silence of streets that no artillery had ever touched. The silence of children asleep in rooms down the hall, who would wake in the morning to a breakfast table where a brown ceramic coffee pot sat in its ordinary place and would be poured without ceremony and drunk without urgency, because abundance in a free country does not announce itself. It simply exists, quietly, on the kitchen table, waiting to be poured. That is what they flew for. That is what they came home to. That is what they built, in their silence and their prosperity and their long, imperfect recovery, out of everything that the sky above Germany had taken from them and given back. It was ordinary. It was abundant. It was, in the final and full measure of things, exactly enough. It was worth every mission they ever flew.